What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for the Thaumaturge, a story-driven RPG from Fool's Theory that puts us in an occult 1905 Warsaw. Now, before we jump into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it does include other things. There's a link below to a video that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Moreover, though, in the case of the Thaumaturge, with this being a very story-focused experience, I want to give people a warning about spoilers. It's very hard to review a very narrative-focused experience without talking about the game's story, which comprises the bulk of what the game is. As such, there's going to be a little bit of spoilers on my part, and then almost guaranteed some contextual stuff in the footage. So with that said, you've been warned, and from there, let's dive into it. Now, as I mentioned, this is a narrative RPG set in 1905 Warsaw. It also includes a bit of turn-based battling with our Thaumaturges, or demons we will be collecting along the way, as we take on the role of our Thaumaturge, Victor Szulski. Victor here is able to use his abilities to track down and interact with Thaumaturges, or demons. Thaumaturges attach themselves to people with flaws, which then amplifies and increases those flaws, causing these people to act erratically, which leads to all sorts of different problems. Victor here is able to come in, find the root of those things, solve them, and thus capture that demon or Thaumaturge for your own, which expands what you're capable of doing, which is what your Thaumaturge powers are. Which means we spend a great deal of time tracking down mysteries in what is effectively occult detective work. However, there are some turn-based battles mixed in there where we're using our Thaumaturge in an almost Pokemon turn-based battle system that we'll get into as well. Now, the good news here is pretty much everything is voice acted besides notes and things like that, so if you're worried about having to read everything in this narrative RPG, there's not too much of a cause for concern there. Next up, though, let's talk about the technical state of this game, as it released very recently, just a little earlier this week. And how it's running is certainly an important thing to know. So in my experience, most of what I encountered was visual bugs, textures loading in weird. Occasionally Victor would spawn like half into the ground when I entered an area before popping back up to where he's supposed to be, and a handful of other things like that were mostly visual in nature. However, I also experienced a couple of crashes, and then in one instance a side quest broke on me, which prevented me from finishing it. And a quick browse through Steam reviews shows me that I'm not the only person to experience these issues, so performance-wise there's a bit to be desired, but it's far from unplayable. And then we have a quick note on difficulty. The difficulty of this game is only directed for the combat, your turn-based battles. You'll have the option between easy, normal, or hard, and mostly this determines how much damage the enemies are doing to you, which means how well you understand the various mechanics at play becomes more and more important. I would say that given the fact that this is a story-based game first and foremost, this isn't deeply important to the rest of the experience and you can change it at any time, but given that we are limited to these turn-based battles with our Thaumaturges, the combat is not terribly difficult no matter how you slice it, but generally speaking, you do have some adjustable difficulty here for those battles. And that brings me to the story and my thoughts on it. So, as I mentioned, the game takes place in 1905 Warsaw within the Russian Empire, and importantly in September of 1905, which is worth mentioning because 1905 was a very significant year for history in terms of the Russian Empire, with the Russian Revolution of 1905 currently ongoing, and the Russo-Japanese War just recently coming to an end, which means there are all sorts of tensions and inspirations for stories to draw from in terms of 1905 Warsaw, and you're going to see some of that in the background of everything else going on. But we specifically play as one Victor Szulski, our Thaumaturge. We've been away from our home of Warsaw for quite some time after coming to a very heated disagreement with our own father 15 years prior. We spent the last significant period of time searching for none other than Rasputin himself, who just so happens to help us get a handle on our power and use it more effectively without driving us crazy, as demons running amok in your mind is actually not a good thing, as it turns out. Now, as all of that is happening, we get called back to Warsaw upon learning that our father recently passed away. Our father was also a thaumaturge, and the game describes this as being some sort of hereditary thing. Rather unsurprisingly, once we get back to Warsaw, as the game starts out outside of it, we eventually attend our father's funeral, speak with our sister that we haven't seen alongside catching up with some old friends, let's say, before discovering that our father's death is not so benign. In fact, there are a lot of mysterious circumstances surrounding it, which leads into the broader plot, both with our personal problems, and then also, of course, with the backdrop of everything I just mentioned earlier. Now, that's as much as I want to say personally, and from there I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanics of the choice and the consequence and my thoughts on it, so trying to avoid spoilers where I can here. First and foremost, we have our pride. You see, Victor's flaw, what initially attracted Salutors to him, was his pride, and this is shown through gameplay by choosing pride options. Now, for the first couple acts of the game, you're mostly just making choices. You don't see a ton of consequences to those choices until you get to Act 3 and later, and one of the most important is choosing whether or not to embrace your pride or not, because if you do this enough, once you get to the late game, certain choices will be made for you. The game will even tell you this choice is being made for you because you've accumulated so much pride. It's very good about telegraphing it, so there is a sort of high and low pride run through the game that's going to have some effect on choices and consequences available to you, and that's to say nothing of the more specific choices on how to deal with each individual situation you're going to run into. And that's where the game is certainly doing its best and is what you would want from a big narrative RPG. So when it comes to making choices, you're pretty much choosing between things like to be prideful or not, and then how you deal with individual certain situations can lock off options from you later. But the bulk of the consequences to your actions and wrapping the story up comes in the, I would say, back half of the game, with much of the earlier portion of the game pretty free-form in its approach. And what I mean by that is early on, I noticed that I was able to do pretty much everything with ease. There are certain investigations and things you'll need to do that require certain progression stats that are very low. And as I was playing through it, doing all of it, I was initially concerned about the balance of these things, as it seemed like I was able to do basically everything I wanted to do with no real repercussions. But most of that comes into effect in the back half of the game, so if you're playing through worried about that, I would wait till Act 3 before you start really seeing too much in the way of consequences. But overall, it's a very interesting story from a very active time in history, with a lot of very interesting historical things happening in the background, of course, adjusted to fit this very occult 1905 aesthetic, which made the story and the consequences of the choices you'll be making very interesting to me personally. So I think it's safe to say I enjoyed the story quite a bit, and I thought it was pretty cool. That, though, brings us to the progression side of things. Progression in this game is pretty simple. It's pretty much down to your abilities or your different dimensions and picking up your Salutors. Now, as you pick up clues, read things, interact with pretty much anything interactable, you'll start earning experience, which gives you Thaumaturge points, which you can spend on one of the game's 4 dimensions. These make up things like heart, mind, word, and deed. Increasing these gives you access to abilities you can use in combat, as well as modifiers to those abilities to make them do more interesting things, and it also increases your stats in each of those dimensions, which are required to unveil certain clues within your investigations. Now, how far you can progress in each of these dimensions is locked off by the Salutors you have discovered. The first 4 Salutors are directly tied to the main story. They're unmissable. However, several of them in the late game are very much so missable. Some you'll come into contact with via the main story, but whether or not you choose to take on that Salutor is up to you. In fact, there's choices to be made in that regard, so even in terms of your progression, you'll be affected by the choices you are then making. Which means things like certain abilities, certain choices as a result, meaning that you can't get to a certain stat within each individual dimension, which might lock you off from content here and there, becomes more apparent the deeper you get into the game. So even when it comes to progression, there are interesting narrative choices to be made. That is pretty much the only progression system though, so not much to cover on that department, which brings us to the gameplay and world. What are we going to be doing? How is this going to work? Well, pretty much we're going to be running around the different districts of Warsaw, of course, which is where we're going to encounter all sorts of quests, learn a bit about the city in 1905, or at least this interpretation of it, and just sort of exploring the vibe and the atmosphere. Probably worth a mention right here, though, that you can wait on benches and things like that to progress to different times of day, which will affect whether or not people are out and about and what you might see in any given area at any given time, which makes the entire city feel decently alive for a game like this. But the main sort of gameplay you'll be encountering is tracking down those investigations that I mentioned, as almost every scrap of content in this game comes down to something like that, as thaumaturges are able to use their perception to sense and understand the emotions that were tied to an object when it was made in some way, which is how thaumaturges can figure out how people felt or what they were thinking when they were doing a certain thing by interacting with items that they came into contact with. We're going to be using this method of investigation on basically everything as we investigate salutors and the people they are attached to, which is where the flaws come in. As we encounter people with flaws, you can actually take those flaws from them, which is usually how you acquire their salutors, but this also does increase your stats a little bit here and there. But even beyond how that relates to the salutors, you'll also do that with just like everyday objects, which can lead you to small side quests that show you areas of the city or just give you a little more information about characters. Now, none of that side of things is voice acted, which means a lot of reading on your part, and it's pretty much the central gameplay mechanic outside of the combat and simply running around. That does lead into a bit of a problem this game has, where kind of just about everything you do feels a little one note, because how you approach any individual situation is basically look for clues, use those clues to draw a conclusion, which then opens up extra options and progressing in any individual quest for you. And this is how the game deals with just tracking down any sort of information that you're going to find, which I could see getting a little old for people after a while. Now, there is a few extra things to do around the city, really, but it's more like appearance-based stuff. Like you can go to a tailor, which will let you customize your clothes based off like magazines and things you found that for the most part just adjust the base visual colors of your outfit. And then you can also go to a barber to change your hairstyle and things a little bit, which is a nice touch, but it doesn't really add too much to the game either. But throughout the game and our exploration and the story, we're going to be coming across people who would like to do us harm for one reason or another, which is where the combat comes in. Combat takes place between Victor, his salutors, and the enemy, of course. In a turn-based system, not terribly different from Pokemon, with a few important changes, of course. Total, you could have up to 8 salutors, and you can use them all in combat at once, but everything you do in combat comes down to the timer of sorts at the top of the battle screen here. Every attack you do takes up so much amount of time and then goes into effect on one of the rounds you'll see at the top. You pick your action independently from whatever your salutor action is. Now, on your salutor action, you can swap to a different one, which may have different styles of approach, such as reducing enemies' focus or dealing more damage or interrupting or delaying their attacks, for instance, on top of whatever you're doing. Now, your abilities, which you can see over the tops of enemies, they kind of look like cards, but this is not card-based, are based off of the abilities you've acquired through your progression systems. You can modify those abilities to have extra effects based on how much you've invested into your Thaumaturge powers, which lets you customize exactly what a lot of these do, but the main mechanic I want to draw attention to here is focus. Each enemy has those diamonds above their health bar, and this is their focus. If you reduce that to 0, you break them and can hit them with a powerful attack only available while they're broken with both you and your salutor, which will do a tremendous amount of damage to them. Otherwise, combat is basically just standard action economy stuff here. You want to do as much damage as you can while minimizing the damage you take, either through breaking enemies, which takes their turn, or delaying or taking their turn through other means. And doing things like that and managing fighting multiple enemies is what you would expect. Now, for me, combat was okay. It's clearly just a system at play to give you something besides reading through stuff to do. And I don't think it's bad by any means, but it's also not going to blow you away. There's a lot of turn-based games like this that do much more interesting things, and I would say the main thing I liked about the combat system was simply that seeing the demons or our Thaumaturges animations and how they attack enemies was really cool. But otherwise, I just wasn't really impressed with the combat by any means. That, though, brings me to my Steam Deck section for the game, and for the most part, as you would probably expect, this game runs fine on the Steam Deck. It has an official preset for the Steam Deck in particular, but I found that to be kind of whatever. In their first patch for the game, it looks like they actually opened that up and you could change and customize these options a little bit and kind of mess around to find a frame rate you would like, but it's got cloud saves, it's got controller support, and the relatively simple nature of the gameplay means there's really not anything you have to worry about on playing this in terms of Steam Deck, except maybe messing around with settings to get yourself a stable frame rate. And then of course, because there's a lot of text and things to read in the game, that text can be very small on a screen like that, which is really about the only consideration I would really be concerned about. Certainly a game you could play on that platform without too much of an issue if you're willing to tweak some settings a little bit, but otherwise not really much to say, which brings me to my positives and my negatives before we move on. So on the positive side of things, pretty much the story and the choices as you would expect from a narrative game. I think the story is really interesting. It takes place during a very tumultuous period of history, and seeing this interpretation of that history set against a dark occult vibe was just really cool for me, and that's to say nothing of the choices and consequences and their effects and the simple fact that I enjoyed watching a lot of those things play out and what happens to Victor after the story, for instance, all of which was really cool. That's when the game is at its best, and that makes sense because that's the main thing the game is trying to do. Now, on the negative side of things, I would say the combat isn't going to wow you, and the actual gameplay is a little one note. You're basically just running around places, picking up clues, making conclusions, and then talking to people before advancing whatever story you've got. And while that story is interesting, how you go about moving through that story just gets a little old after a while. And unfortunately, how they choose to break that up is with the combat, which is also just not that great. Realistically, though, I loved seeing the Thaumaturges in action via combat, but I just wish it had more going on otherwise, and unfortunately, it just doesn't. Which brings me to my conclusion. Despite some mild annoyances, the Thaumaturge is a mostly really fun game to play if you enjoy a good narrative RPG. If you like a game that tells you a cool story in a very interesting setting and world, this is a great game for you. Now, on the flip side of that, if you want pretty much anything else from this game, it's not going to give it to you. So if you are purely interested in that narrative RPG experience, I think it can be fun and worth your time. And I feel like I got my money's worth out of it for $35, which I did in fact pay for. I didn't get a review copy for this one. And having played through all of it, I'm good with having paid for it. So to put it simply, cool story, cool choice and consequence, great atmosphere, worth it if that's what you're looking for. And that is pretty much going to do it for this particular title. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. March is a very busy month for game releases, and we have quite a bit to get through, so I hope you hang around for it. Regardless of all that though, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.